they have the potential of being really interesting, but sadly, I find them kind of boring.
Well, I think the easy answer would be those random episodes that we all have in the back of our heads where, maybe it started as an interesting idea or it kind of went off the rails or it didn't quite come together the way it should have or just truly weird. But to be honest, those episodes, or at least a lot of them, are fun, at least for the memes. I don't think there is much I would change about the Star Trek franchise because it's always changing. That's the beauty of it. It evolves with the times. It always kind of harkens to a brighter future that awakens new possibilities in our imaginations. It's the reason we have cell phones. If you don't like one Star Trek, just watch the next episode and there's something for everyone. So I don't know if there's a lot I would fundamentally change about the Star Trek franchise. I think I just am excited to see what comes next and what, strange new worlds and civilizations we can push, what that next final frontier will truly look like. I love Star Trek. What can I say?
When I was watching DS9 in the 90s, I was overjoyed with the serialized stories that started to be shown. And I think, funnily enough, the restrictions placed on them then actually really served those serials. If we go forward now to Discovery and Picard particularly, I actually think it's gone the other way. I think they're so serialized that it's a bit difficult to kind of pick any standalone episodes out. Now, of course, we do have examples of that, but it's kind of hard in that way. So if there was one thing I would change is I would lean closer now to the Strange New Worlds formula, is that I would bring back episodic Trek kind of across the board. I'm not saying abandon season arcs altogether. I mean, we had them in previous Treks, but I'd say stop being so reliant on having every episode be a chapter and have it be its own story. That would be what I would change.
This isn't so much a change as it is just a request. I would just hope that every Star Trek show from now till eternity bears in mind that the in-universe canon is very important, and to maintain some semblance of that. Don't completely go off the rails unless you are saying it's a reboot or some kind of reimagining. Stick to the canon. You got a whole universe of people, events, planets, species. Use them and don't change them. Make them be what they have been represented to be for all this time. So just use the canon wisely and understand exactly what canon is and what it means to people.
So if there was one thing that I would change about Star Trek as a franchise, it would actually be to make sure that there were more diverse writers on Star Trek right from the franchise's inception in the 1960s, as well as in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s as well. Like, don't get me wrong, Star Trek has always been a very inclusive franchise, especially in front of the camera. While there were a few women and LGBTQ writers like DC Fontana and David Gerrold, who were there right from close to the start of the franchise, they were few and far between in some cases, and also, even in those cases, especially with someone like David Gerrold, they were sometimes actively pushed out or felt, persecuted because of who they were behind the scenes. And I think that that is sort of one of the big failings of Star Trek as a franchise, especially in its first few decades, is that, it worked really well to be inclusive in front of the camera, but didn't always bring these voices to prominence behind it all the time. I mean, if you look at like Deep Space Nine, which I think is easily, qualitatively the best Star Trek show, even there, if you look at the last season of Deep Space Nine, there's not a single credited women writer for that entire final season. Which I think is just, not only just, failing at what Star Trek has always been about IDIC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations, and allowing all of our voices to come together to be something greater than the whole, but I think it also does a disservice to some of the stories that were able to be told. Again, I love Star Trek, but I think that sometimes it missed the mark on certain issues and in certain aspects because it didn't have that diverse voice behind the scenes that it could have had. And I also think it's what led to the franchise's eventual fatigue. I mean, if you look at Star Trek Enterprise, which is, again, a show that I love, it struggled its first few years because Rick Berman and Brannon Braga were the ones leading that show. And no shade at Brannon Braga, but they were people who had been working on that franchise for over 20 years at that point. And I really think like fresh voices, especially from perspectives that hadn't really been uplifted by Star Trek as a franchise until that point, I think really could have helped stop that dark age without Star Trek, when I think we really could have used Star Trek during those years. So I think that's probably the biggest thing about Star Trek that I would change as a franchise.
If there's one thing I would change about Star Trek, it would be in The Next Generation, Season 1, Episode 23, Skin of Evil, where the crew are up against, I think, a villain called Armus, and we lose Tasha Yar with just like a flippant show of his strength. If there was anything within The Next Generation's first season that made me feel like, it kind of popped the bubble for me, made me feel like I wasn't included in the world, it kind of, I don't know, it threw me a bit, and I felt like this was someone who was written out. And it turns out there was a little bit of a story behind it, and it wasn't, you know, the best situation for Tasha. But let's just say, or Denise, let's just say though, if I could change anything, I'd either not let her die, or I'd give her a much more meaningful death. Give her opportunity to fight, like, you know, as Worf might say, with honor, like a Klingon would say. I feel like that is one thing that really upsets me about the first season of TNG, even though I love it so dearly.
This isn't something I change in Star Trek, it's something I change about myself, and I wish that I had started watching Star Trek sooner. You know, growing up, I liked things like Doctor Who, but I very much kept that to myself. And it wasn't through a lack of my mum trying to get me to watch Star Trek, but I had this kind of notion that it wasn't something that I should watch. And I wish I had just kind of put those views aside and just been me earlier on and just gone, do you know what? I like sci-fi. That doesn't make me any less feminine. That doesn't make me any less popular, which I was never popular, but I think I should have just put those prejudices aside because I was bringing them upon myself. And Star Trek has so many hidden messages on real life that I probably would have learned to accept myself a little bit more by just letting go of those things and watching it earlier on.
Honestly, the respect to TOS and the 2260s as an era in all the Treks, yes, Prodigy and Lower Decks do maintain that vibe, but Discovery and Strange New Worlds, and sometimes Picard, sometimes not, they basically throw out the original look. Back in the 1960s, that's when Star Trek was born, that aesthetic, that vibe. It was found by fans all around the world. Those fans got so enamoured with the show, they loved it so much, they did a letter writing campaign, unheard of at the time, to bring it back. That series was so loved, it got an animated series, a movie, and then an entire franchise. There are hundreds of millions of fans out there who would like to see TOS respected fully. Now, while Strange New Worlds is a great show, and it really is, its art design is lovely, it's too far in the let's change it because we can, we feel like we need to vibe. Lower Decks and Prodigy both recreated TOS elements beautifully, faithfully, and they look fantastic. Star Trek is a period piece, and while yes, it may be aging visually, that's still the look it had. It disrespects the fans that fought to get Trek back on the air, those that went and see TMP, all of those people back in the day who made Star Trek a thing. We don't throw away A New Hope. In fact, modern Star Wars continues to reuse design elements. Yes, they're more polished, fine. But we're not throwing out the old green and black holograms of the 1970s because they look too old. They're in there because it's a period piece, and Star Wars fans will not accept a change. TOS is also a period piece, and it just saddens me so much that Discovery and Strange New Worlds have thrown away, for the most part, what those eras look like. Yes, Strange New Worlds is before, but it's hard to imagine their look becomes the TOS look. But keep true to the period piece of the 2260s. It's so important to Trek fans, and those of us that love design, to throw that away it devalues all the other shows. So let's hope that going forward they can respect TOS just that bit more, just as Star Wars has done with the original trilogy. Let's hope.
What one thing would I change in Star Trek? Again, this is something that we've already done content on, and that's making the new Trek era uniforms consistent. We're jumping all over the place. There's like a new uniform every week. Whereas like with the TOS and TNG era, you know, there was like a good period of time spent with each uniform. Too many overlapping, too many clashing. I just want it to be consistent for a little while. Just a decade of the same uniform. Instead, there's like 5 different uniforms within 10 years. We did the math, we back-traced it.
I think I would change Captain Kirk's death in Star Trek Generations. Actually, I'm tempted to say that I would like a do-over for all of Star Trek Generations. But if I could pick just one thing, it would be Kirk's death. I mean, think about this. You're going to give an on-screen death to arguably the most important character in Star Trek, or at least one of the 2 most important characters in Star Trek, because it's either Kirk or Spock. And Kirk is the lead protagonist of the original series, arguably the lead protagonist of the entire franchise, the first Star Trek starship captain that the audience got to know, and you're going to give him an on-screen death, which you don't have to do. There's no rule that says you have to kill Kirk off on screen, but they chose to do it in Generations. And if you're going to do that, you should really have a good idea for like an awesome, memorable death. Something that'll really have impact and power, and people who see it will never forget it. And they just didn't do any of that in Generations. Kirk just kind of comes out of the Nexus to help Picard win a fight against a guy who's trying to do a thing. He falls off a metal bridge and rolls down a hill and gets crushed under the bridge and says a couple of lines to Picard, a character who he just met like 5 minutes ago, and then that's it. And he gets buried under a pile of rocks. Thanks, Captain Kirk. I feel like we can do better than that for a death scene for Captain Kirk. And if you can't do better than that for a death scene for Captain Kirk, then don't do it.
Tell you what I change about Star Trek, right? This is more criticism of just, I think, modern television production habits more than it is a criticism of modern Star Trek, right? But what I would change, right, is the stakes. The thing that put me off Discovery, right, and this might be fair criticism or it might just be in my head, but the thing that put me off over time was it felt like every single week the stakes were as high as they could possibly be, and it was the most emotional climax to an episode imaginable, and then next week you just start again on a brand new thing, right? I still, for comfort watching, will go back to The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, and some episodes, right, nothing matters. Nothing could possibly matter. I watched the first one. You know, they get Moriarty in for the first time and say, oh, computer, devise an evil villain who could defeat a Data. Whoops, I meant to say Holmes. Remember all that, right? In my head, that episode is the one where he escapes the holodeck. I thought that was one, but no, the one before it, where he just captures Dr. Pulaski, says he's probably not going to hurt her. Then Picard goes in, explains that he can't ever leave the holodeck, and they put him in a box. And that's it! The Enterprise is kind of a bit of threat, and the systems are malfunctioning a bit, and what's going to happen with Pulaski, but like, that's it! That was it! Those were the whole stakes. I was just like, that's good television, that. So the thing I would change about Star Trek is it just doesn't have to be the warp core going to breach every single week, okay? Just let me have a nothing episode every now and then.
So it's hard to say that I would change anything. I mean, I love Star Trek warts and all, and I kind of like almost like it because of its warts, you know? Like I kind of like when it falls down on its face. It's not entertaining necessarily, but you kind of like love it a little bit more when it's flawed and it's imperfect. So there's not much I would really change about Star Trek. I think maybe the one thing that really bugged me back when it first aired and kind of continues to bug me is that Discovery was set in the Prime universe, but it didn't really ever feel like it. And I know that goes against what I just said about not really caring about continuity, but Discovery in the Prime universe never really made sense. It always made way more sense when they took the show to the 32nd century and had like a completely blank slate to tell stories in. But yeah, I think that was a big mistake putting Discovery in the Prime universe. Should have been a Kelvin Timeline show.
Well, you know, my pet peeve, really, and I do have a pet peeve, and I don't know what you feed yours, but well, anyway, my pet peeve is that ever since Gene died, the technology of the show has frozen in place. It isn't progressing in a fascinating way, which is something that Roddenberry was the heart of. I think that even in the new shows, any new tech that they have is them just trying to keep up with the 21st century. And that's pretty crazy. There was a time when you looked to Star Trek for, you know, like when there were flip phones. People are going, how did they know? It's just a little extra work, a little research, and projecting ahead into the future. And that's one of the things I loved about Star Trek that I don't really see anymore. I don't see any new technology that's going to happen in the next 20 years that will say Star Trek invented it, when really it was Star Trek just doing its homework.
I sort of feel like the culture of humanity is sort of stagnated in Star Trek. Like, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of new art coming out. All of the art and music that they listen to and appreciate is like based on like ancient history for them. I know it's basically just because they didn't want to pay the royalties or commission an artist to make a new song because it would be too expensive, so they just used some like, I don't know, public domain stuff. I think that it would be really cool if they could hire like an actual talented artist to create what they thought would be the music of the 24th century. I just think it would bring the whole universe to life, like way more than it has, because it seems like they're just stuck in the past artistically. They're not really evolving in terms of music, in terms of paintings, in terms of anything really.
You, yes, you, if you are a gatekeeper. Star Trek community is great in that it takes on the values of the show, you know, like acceptance, forward thinking, working together as a whole. But then there's some people that seem to have missed the point of what Trek is. Change is inevitable. Gone are the days of watching TNG, DS9 and Voyager on BBC Two at 6 o'clock. It's great, but it's not coming back. You know, we've got like Trek in so many new and interesting ways, and it's great to have it in all these different mediums. It's okay if it's not for you, you know, that's fair enough. But like a true Star Trek fan knows when to check their opinions at the door.
If there's one thing about Star Trek I would change, it's probably the Klingons. I don't mind them, but I find a lot of the episodes that focus on them quite boring. Klingon politics is boring. I get it, they're about war and honor and stuff, but it does nothing for me. It's always quite dour, which I've said before, is not really what I like in Star Trek. I like Worf as kind of a joke character. I like him being told no. I like him in DS9 as well when they sort of fleshed him out a bit more. But when it's just an episode of Klingons headbutting each other and screaming into the sky, I kind of get a bit bored. So I would change them. I don't know how. Make them a bit more interesting. Have them as a warrior race, that's fine. But let's give them something more interesting. Let's make them not just one-dimensional, I think, because after a while it just gets to the point of, I get it, I know what they're going to be like, I know what they're going to do. And you could say that about a lot of Star Trek races, but I think they have the potential of being really interesting, but sadly, I find them kind of boring.
My change to Star Trek wouldn't actually be to the show or the franchise, it would be to the fan base. Now, hear me out. I'm a big proponent of letting people watch what they enjoy, and everyone is entitled to an opinion. That being said, I don't think that it is healthy to the community for us to do heavy gatekeeping or policing what people can and can't like in the franchise. It's the quickest way to keep new people out of the franchise and alienate those that are new. If we want to open up Star Trek to a larger audience, the easiest thing to do is to just let people watch and enjoy Star Trek how they want to, and to just keep your opinions to yourself if it's gonna hurt someone else's feelings. It's that easy.